There is a subject that sits quietly at the edge of almost every philosophical tradition that has ever existed, one that has been approached with tenderness, with curiosity, with intellectual precision, and sometimes with a kind of wonder. It is a subject that touches every human life without exception, and yet it is one that, in the ordinary course of things, we tend to set to one side, leaving it for later, always for later. The subject is death, or more precisely, what philosophers have thought and said and felt about death, about mortality, about the fact that every life has a shape, a beginning and an ending, and about what that shape might mean. This is not going to be an anxious exploration. The philosophers who have engaged with this subject most deeply have, for the most part, not been made more fearful by their engagement. Many of them have been made more peaceful. Many of them have found, in careful reflection, on death and impermanence, not something to dread, but something that clarifies, that illuminates, that gives a quality of attention and appreciation to the life being lived. That is the spirit in which we will move through this material tonight. Slowly, without urgency, with the same patient curiosity that the best philosophers have brought to the question. What is death, philosophically speaking? At the simplest level, it is the ending of a life, the cessation of the biological and psychological processes that together constitute the living of a human existence. But even this simple description opens almost immediately into much deeper questions. Is the person who dies genuinely gone, or does something persist? What is the relationship between the death we will each die and the deaths of those we love? Is death bad, and if so, in what sense? What does the fact of our mortality mean for how we should live? And is there any way of understanding death that makes it less of an adversary, more of a companion, not something that threatens life, but something that is simply part of it? These questions have been taken up by philosophers from ancient India to ancient Greece, from medieval Europe to modern America, from Stoic sages to existentialist novelists. The range of perspectives is enormous, and we will move through many of them. But we can begin with what is perhaps the most elegant and the most historically influential philosophical argument about death. The argument offered by the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus in the 3rd century before the Common Era. Epicurus was a philosopher of pleasure and of peace. He lived in Athens, in a garden that served as his school, and he taught his students that the goal of philosophy was eudaimonia, a Greek word often translated as happiness or flourishing, and that the chief obstacle to happiness was not suffering itself, or even the prospect of suffering, but the fear of suffering, and especially the fear of death. Epicurus believed that much of the anxiety and distress of human life arose from the anticipation of death, from the way that the thought of not existing haunted the living, casting a shadow over everything that might otherwise be enjoyed and appreciated. And he thought this fear was based on a mistake. The argument he offered is elegantly simple, and it has a quality of calm inevitability that makes it one of the most quoted passages in all of ancient philosophy. He wrote, "Death is nothing to us, for while we are, death has not come, and when death has come, we are not." The argument is brief, but its logic is patient. Death, Epicurus points out, is not an experience. When we imagine death, we tend to imagine it as something that will happen to us, as though there will be a moment of cessation that we will somehow be present for, as though we will be there to witness the absence of ourselves. But this is an incoherent picture. At the moment of death, the person who might have feared it is no longer there to undergo anything. Death is not a state that the dead person is in. It is the absence of any state at all. This is sometimes called the Epicurean argument or the symmetry argument. Its full form notes that the state of non-existence after death is symmetrical to the state of non-existence before birth. We do not typically worry about the vast period of time before we were born. The billions of years of the universe's history that preceded our existence. That period of non-existence seems, from where we stand, like nothing at all. Not an unpleasant nothingness, not a frightening one, just nothing, a blank, a silence. Epicurus suggests that our non-existence after death will be exactly the same. There will be no one there to be in pain, to feel loss, to suffer the absence of what was once had. The dead do not miss being alive, because missing is something only the living can do. The Epicurean argument is genuinely compelling. There is something clarifying about it, something that cuts through the fog of vague anxiety and replaces it with a clean and simple observation. And yet, it has not, for most people, been entirely sufficient. Most people, confronted with the Epicurean argument, can see its logic clearly and still feel that death is somehow bad, that it represents a loss, a deprivation, a cutting short of something that had value. And philosophers have taken this residual feeling seriously enough to try to articulate exactly what it is that the Epicurean argument misses. The most influential response to Epicurus was developed by the contemporary philosopher Thomas Nagel in a 1970 essay called Death, which has become one of the most widely read pieces of philosophy produced in the 20th century. Nagel does not deny Epicurus's premise. He accepts that death is not an experience, that the dead person undergoes nothing. But he argues that this does not show that death is not bad. Things can be bad for a person without that person experiencing the badness. The crucial concept is deprivation. Nagel argues that death is bad for the person who dies because it deprives them of something good, namely, the continued experience of a life. Life, most of the time, is something of positive value. It contains good things, experiences, relationships, projects, pleasures, the satisfactions of understanding and achievement. Death brings all of this to an end. The person who dies is deprived of all the good things that their continued life would have contained. This deprivation is bad for them, even though they are not there to feel it, just as other forms of deprivation can be bad for a person even when they are not felt. Nagel offers an illustration. Suppose someone suffers a catastrophic injury that reduces them permanently to the mental level of a contented infant. They have no awareness of what has been lost, no distress, no suffering. Are they harmed by what has happened? Nagel thinks clearly, yes. Even though they experience no pain, they have been deprived of the capacities and the life that they once had and might have continued to have. Their harm lies not in the experience of the loss, but in the loss itself. And death, Nagel suggests, is a loss of this kind, an ultimate deprivation of all that life might have continued to offer. The deprivation account of the badness of death is now widely, though not universally, accepted in philosophy. It captures the intuition that death can be tragic without having to claim that the dead person suffers. It explains why we regard the premature death of a young person as more terrible than the death of someone who has lived a full and complete life, because the former is deprived of more, and it connects the badness of death to the value of life, which seems like the right connection to make. But the deprivation account also raises interesting questions. If death is bad because it deprives us of future goods, then the badness of death depends on what kind of future life would have been available. A death that cuts short a life full of prospect is, on this view, worse than one that comes after most of those prospects have been realized. This suggests that death at different stages of life might be differently bad, or, to put it more gently, differently significant. The death of a child is bad in a different way from the death of a very old person who has lived fully, not because one life is more valuable than another, but because the deprivation involved is different in character and extent. There is also the question of whether the badness of death is unlimited, whether more life is always better, making death always worse the sooner it comes. This question has been engaged by several philosophers, perhaps most interestingly by Bernard Williams, in a celebrated essay called The Macabre and the Case for Mortality, more commonly known under the title The Tedium of Immortality. Williams argues that the prospect of an immortal life is not, on reflection, as attractive as it might first appear, that a genuinely endless life would, at some point, become a burden rather than a gift, and that mortality may be not only an inevitable feature of human existence, but a necessary one for the kind of life we recognize as distinctively human. Bernard Williams's argument about immortality draws on a thought experiment. He asks us to consider a story, the story of a woman named Macropulos, drawn from a Czech opera, who has taken an elixir that stopped her aging at the age of 42. She has been 42 for more than 300 years, and rather than finding this a blessing, she has found it the source of a growing, irreversible boredom and disengagement from life. She no longer cares about anything. She no longer wants anything. She has, in a sense, run out of reasons to go on. Williams uses this story to make a philosophical point. He argues that what makes a life genuinely mine, what gives it the character of my life, with my particular commitments, projects, and values, is constituted in part by my being the particular kind of person I am. And the person I am is shaped, over time, by my history, my experiences, my choices, my relationships. But there is a limit to how much a single person can develop, change, and find genuinely new things to care about. A life of truly unlimited duration would, Williams suggests, eventually exhaust all the categorical desires, the desires to be and do and become specific things that give a life its forward momentum and its meaning. What would remain after that exhaustion would not be a richer version of the life already lived, but something increasingly empty, increasingly alien to the person who had set out on the journey. This argument has been contested in various ways. Some philosophers have pointed out that Williams's conclusion might apply to the specific character of Macropulos, a person who, for whatever reason, stopped being able to develop and change, but might not apply to a person who continued to grow, to take on new projects, to form new relationships, to find new things to care about. If immortality is possible for a being who retains the capacity for genuine change and development, perhaps it would not be subject to Williams's boredom objection. But Williams's deeper point is subtler than simply noting that boredom would eventually set in. His deeper point is about the relationship between mortality and identity. A genuinely immortal person would, over a long enough span, become so different from the person they started, as that it is doubtful whether the continuity of a single self would really be maintained. The person who has lived for 1,000 years is connected to the person who began that life by a chain of gradual changes, but is so different in character, interests, memories, and orientation that the claim to be the same person begins to strain credibility. And if a truly immortal life would eventually require giving up the specific identity one currently has, the particular person one is now, with one's current loves and commitments and ways of seeing, then it is not clear that immortality would be a continuation of one's current life so much as its eventual replacement by something else. What Williams's reflections suggest is that mortality, while it represents a loss, is also a condition that gives life its particular character. It is because our lives are finite that they have the shape they have, that choices matter, that time is precious, that the particular people and experiences and moments of one's own particular life are irreplaceable rather than endlessly repeatable. A finite life has the character of a particular narrative, with a beginning and an arc, and eventually an ending. An infinite life might be something quite different. Not a narrative, but an endless accumulation. Not a story with shape and meaning, but something more formless and ultimately harder to inhabit. This connects to a theme that is central to one of the most influential philosophical treatments of death in the modern period, the work of Martin Heidegger. Heidegger was a German philosopher who lived from 1889 to 1976, and his major work, Being and Time, published in 1927, contains an account of death and mortality that has shaped the philosophy of death ever since. Even among philosophers who find much else in Heidegger's work difficult or unconvincing. Heidegger's central insight about death is not primarily that it is frightening or that it is a loss. Though he acknowledges both of these dimensions, his central insight is that death, or more precisely, the constant awareness of one's own mortality, is one of the primary conditions for living authentically. Heidegger uses the phrase being toward death to describe what he thinks is our most fundamental orientation when we genuinely confront our mortality. We are, all of us, beings who are heading toward death, beings for whom death is not some remote eventuality, but a constant possibility, something that could come at any time, that cannot be transferred or delegated, that is irreducibly one's own. When we really take in this fact, when we do not merely know it abstractly, but feel its weight and its intimacy, something happens to our relationship with life. Heidegger calls this angst, a word usually translated as anxiety, though it is closer to a kind of existential unease, a confrontation with the groundlessness and finitude of one's own existence. Angst, for Heidegger, is not a psychological disorder or a distressing emotion to be avoided. It is a form of lucidity, a way of seeing one's life as it truly is, stripped of the comfortable distractions and evasions that ordinarily soften the awareness of one's finitude. Most of the time, Heidegger argues, we live in what he calls das Man, the they, the anonymous social world of habits, conventions, and public opinion that absorbs us and makes us feel less alone, but also less ourselves. In the world of das Man, death is acknowledged but domesticated. It happens to people. People die, one knows this, but it is somehow kept at a distance from one's own first-person existence. People say one dies as though death were something that happens to some general, anonymous one, not specifically to me. This evasion, Heidegger thinks, is one of the primary modes of inauthentic existence, a way of not facing what is most fundamental about one's own situation. When angst breaks through, when the awareness of one's own mortality suddenly becomes vivid and close, the comfortable anonymity of das Man falls away, and one is confronted with the bare fact of one's own existence, one's own irreplaceable particularity, one's own freedom to choose how to live the time that is available. This confrontation, while unsettling, is, for Heidegger, the condition of authentic existence, of a life genuinely owned and genuinely directed, rather than simply drifting along in the current of social habit and expectation. It is important to note that Heidegger is not recommending anxiety as a permanent state, or suggesting that we should spend our lives preoccupied with death. His point is more about what happens when we allow the awareness of our finitude to do its philosophical work, to clarify what matters, to dissolve certain kinds of self-deception, to make our choices feel more genuinely ours. After this confrontation, after the angst has done its clarifying work, one can return to ordinary life, to the world of relationships and projects and daily activities, but with a different quality of awareness, a greater sense of what is truly at stake in the choices being made. The Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome had arrived, by a very different route, at some conclusions that resonate with Heidegger's, though expressed in a very different vocabulary and spirit. The Stoics, whose tradition stretches from Zeno of Citium in the 4th century, before the Common Era, through philosophers like Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius in the Roman period, were deeply interested in the cultivation of a certain kind of equanimity, a settled inner calm that could survive the vicissitudes of an uncertain and often painful world. And death as the ultimate uncertainty, the ultimate loss that might be suffered, was central to their practice of equanimity. The Stoics taught a practice known as memento mori, remember that you will die. This was not intended as a morbid exercise in self-torture, but as a way of keeping one's relationship with life clear and honest. If one genuinely remembers that everything in one's life is mortal, that the people one loves will die, that one's own body will cease to function, that all circumstances and situations are temporary, then one is less likely to cling too desperately to any of them, less likely to be catastrophically undone when they change or end. The Stoic who has meditated regularly on death and impermanence is not a person emptied of feeling or attachment. He or she is a person whose feeling and attachment has been purified of the desperate, grasping quality that makes loss so devastating, who can love fully and openly while also holding what is loved with a certain lightness, knowing that it is given temporarily rather than owned permanently. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, who kept a private philosophical journal that has come down to us as the Meditations, returns again and again to the theme of impermanence and mortality. He reminds himself, repeatedly, that all things pass, that the great figures of history, the magnificent and the powerful, the famous and the beloved, have all dissolved into the earth, and that his own moment of prominence is no different. He uses this awareness not to depress himself, but to free himself from the grip of vanity and ambition and the fear of loss. Everything is already borrowed, he seems to say, and the appropriate response to what is borrowed is gratitude for the time of its use, not despair at its return. Seneca, another Roman Stoic who lived in the 1st century of the Common Era, wrote extensively and beautifully about time, mortality, and the right relationship with death. His letters to Lucilius contain some of the most moving philosophical prose in any language about these themes. One of his central ideas is that most people effectively shorten their lives not through any physical shortcoming, but through the way they spend their time, through distraction, through deferring what truly matters, through filling their hours with things that do not, in the end, satisfy. The person who lives with awareness of their mortality, Seneca suggests, is paradoxically more capable of living fully, of spending their time on what genuinely matters to them, rather than on what merely passes the time. There is a famous sentence attributed to Seneca that captures this idea with great economy. Dum diffitur vita, transcurrit. While we delay, life passes. The awareness of mortality is, in Seneca's view, a corrective to this delay, a reminder that the time available is real, finite, and already passing, and that the appropriate response is not panic, but purposeful, attentive living. The Stoic tradition also developed a practice known as negative visualization, the deliberate imagining of loss, of the absence of things and people, one values as a way of cultivating appreciation for their presence. If one regularly imagines life without the people one loves, or without the circumstances one takes for granted, one is more likely to genuinely appreciate them when they are there, rather than taking them for granted in the way that familiarity tends to produce. The meditating philosopher who imagines the death of a loved one does not become numb to that prospect. On the contrary, the imagining tends to increase the warmth and attention with which the beloved is currently regarded. What is contemplated as finite becomes more vivid, more precious, more genuinely seen. This practice might sound counterintuitive. Why voluntarily imagine unpleasant scenarios? But the Stoic insight is that the avoidance of such thoughts does not make one less vulnerable to the things they represent. It simply means that when loss comes, as it inevitably will, one is caught entirely unprepared, overwhelmed by something that careful prior reflection might have made more navigable. The Stoic is not trying to extinguish feeling, but to create a different relationship with the prospect of loss, one that is honest without being paralyzed, open without being desperate. One of the most remarkable and enduring philosophical depictions of a person facing death with equanimity is the account Plato gives of the last hours of Socrates. In his dialogue, the Phaedo, Socrates was the great Athenian philosopher, the teacher of Plato, and the intellectual ancestor of much of the Western philosophical tradition. He was condemned to death in 399 BCE at the age of 70 for allegedly corrupting the youth of Athens and introducing new gods. His execution was to be carried out by drinking hemlock, a poison whose effects are slow and relatively painless. What is astonishing about Plato's account of Socrates' final hours is the quality of calm that characterizes them. Socrates is not merely accepting his fate with resignation, he is genuinely serene, genuinely interested, genuinely present to the philosophical conversation he is having with his friends, who are weeping and distressed on his behalf. He seems, in Plato's telling, to have achieved something, some understanding of death that has genuinely transformed his relationship with it, not as a performance of philosophical virtue, but as an authentic expression of how he actually feels. Socrates argues in the Phaedo that the philosopher, properly understood, is someone who has spent their life in a kind of preparation for death, not in the morbid sense of anticipating it fearfully, but in the sense of gradually detaching from the purely bodily and sensory aspects of experience and learning to dwell more fully in the contemplative life of the mind. The pleasures and pains of the body, for Socrates, are the primary sources of what he calls the nailing of the soul to the body, the attachment to physical things that makes death seem terrible. The philosopher who has learned to find satisfaction in understanding, in the contemplation of truth, in the life of reason, rather than of sense, is in Socrates' view less bound to the body and therefore less threatened by its cessation. This argument is embedded in a broader metaphysical framework, Plato's theory of the soul and its immortality, that many subsequent readers have found more difficult to accept. Plato has Socrates offer several arguments in the Phaedo for the immortality of the soul. The argument from opposites, which holds that life and death generate each other, as all opposites do. The argument from recollection, which holds that our ability to recognize perfect forms and mathematical truths proves that the soul knew these things before birth. The argument from the nature of the soul, which holds that the soul, as something that knows and loves the eternal forms, must itself be more like the eternal forms than like the mortal body. These arguments are subtle and historically important, and philosophers continue to study and debate them. But their force is not universally felt, and many philosophical treatments of death proceed without relying on any claim about the soul's survival. What remains compelling in the picture of Socrates, regardless of whether one accepts the metaphysical framework, is the quality of the equanimity itself. The description Plato gives of his teacher in those final hours has moved readers for 2,500 years. Not because everyone has been convinced by Socrates' arguments, but because the equanimity itself seems genuinely admirable, genuinely possible, genuinely worth aspiring to. Whether or not the soul is immortal, Socrates seems to show that a human being can face death without being overwhelmed by it, that preparation and understanding can change one's relationship to what would otherwise be a terrifying prospect. The great traditions of Eastern philosophy have approached death and mortality with a depth and variety that is comparable to the Western traditions, and in some ways they have a different flavor. Less concerned with arguing for specific metaphysical conclusions and more focused on cultivating the quality of understanding and the relationship with impermanence that enables equanimity. Buddhism, which began with the historical figure of Siddhartha Gautama in India in the 5th century, before the Common Era, places impermanence, anicca in the Pali language, at the very center of its diagnosis of human suffering. The Buddha taught that suffering arises from tanha, craving, thirst, grasping, and that the root of craving is the failure to understand and accept the impermanent nature of everything that exists. We suffer not simply because things change and end, but because we cling to them, because we resist their changing, because we build our sense of security and happiness on things that are by their nature unstable. The Buddhist teaching on impermanence is not merely an intellectual proposition. It is something to be gradually and deeply understood through practice, through meditation, through the slow, patient observation of experience as it actually is, moment by moment. When one watches experience carefully, without the filtering of habit and expectation, what becomes visible is the constant arising and passing of phenomena. The fact that every sensation, every thought, every emotion is arising newly and passing away, that nothing in experience is fixed or permanent, that the very self that seems to be the stable witness of this arising and passing is itself a flow, a process, a succession of moments rather than a fixed entity. To deeply understand impermanence in this experiential way, not just to know it intellectually, but to see it directly in the texture of one's own experience, is, in the Buddhist teaching, the beginning of liberation. When the grasping at permanence relaxes, when the resistance to change softens, when the desperate clinging to self and to experience gives way to a more open and accepting relationship with the flow of things, what arises is not grief, but something closer to peace. Not a numbed or empty peace, but a warm and responsive peace. One that can be fully present to whatever is arising, can appreciate what is good and beautiful in it, and can release it without despair when it passes. The relationship between this Buddhist practice and the question of death is direct. Death is the ultimate impermanence, the final passing of a particular configuration of experience and consciousness. If one has cultivated through practice a genuine acceptance of impermanence in its smaller forms, the passing of pleasant experiences, the ending of happy periods, the change and eventual loss of things one values, then the prospect of the ultimate impermanence becomes less overwhelming. Not because death no longer matters, but because the relationship with all endings has been fundamentally transformed. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition developed over many centuries an extremely detailed and systematic engagement with the process of dying and what follows it, encoded most famously in the Bardo Thodol, or Tibetan Book of the Dead. This text was traditionally read aloud to the dying and recently dead, as a guide through the experiences of the transition from life. The tradition treats death not as a sudden ending, but as a process, a journey through different stages of dissolution and transition, and the practices associated with it are aimed at enabling the dying person to approach this journey with as much awareness and equanimity as possible. Whatever one makes of the specific metaphysical claims of this tradition, about the nature of consciousness after death, about rebirth and the bardos, what is striking about it is the depth of the practical and philosophical attention it has given to the experience of dying. In many Western cultures, death has become something that happens in hospitals, something managed by professionals, something sequestered from the ordinary business of life. The Tibetan tradition, by contrast, treats the preparation for dying as one of the most important spiritual and philosophical undertakings available to a human being, something that deserves the same care and attention as the preparation for any other significant journey. The Hindu philosophical traditions also engage deeply with death and impermanence, and they do so within a metaphysical framework very different from the Western one. The Bhagavad Gita, one of the most important texts in the Hindu tradition, contains a famous dialogue between the warrior Arjuna and the god Krishna, in which Krishna addresses Arjuna's horror at the prospect of the battle he is about to fight. A battle that will involve the deaths of people Arjuna knows and loves. Krishna's teaching to Arjuna includes a profound philosophical engagement with the nature of the self and of death. Krishna teaches that the true self, the Atman, the innermost essence of a person, is not the body and is not subject to death. The body is born and dies, but that which inhabits the body, the eternal self, is beyond birth and death. The famous passage in the Gita compares the soul to a person who changes garments. The body is like a garment, worn for a time and then put aside, while the essential person who wore it continues. This metaphysical claim is not presented as an intellectual proposition to be debated, but as a truth to be directly realized, something that, when genuinely understood, transforms one's relationship with both life and death. Even setting aside the specific metaphysical claims, the Gita's teaching has a philosophical dimension that does not depend on them. the teaching about non-attachment, about performing one's duties and engaging fully with life without clinging to outcomes, without identifying one's ultimate well-being with the preservation of any particular circumstance, is a teaching that can be received and practiced without requiring belief in a particular metaphysics of the soul. The invitation to hold the things of life with a certain lightness, to act with full engagement but without desperate clinging, to be present to what is while knowing that all things pass. This is an invitation with resonances across many traditions, and it speaks to a quality of relationship with impermanence that has practical and philosophical value, independent of the specific frameworks in which it is embedded. The philosopher and essayist Montaigne, writing in 16th century France, engaged with death in a way that is distinctively personal and humanist. His essay, that to philosophize is to learn to die, is one of the most honest and reflective pieces of writing about death in any tradition. Montaigne does not offer arguments or metaphysical consolations. He simply thinks aloud, with characteristic honesty, about his own relationship with the prospect of death, about how he has managed, through reflection and familiarity with the idea, to make it less threatening, more simply, part of the texture of life. Montaigne's approach is deeply Epicurean in spirit, though he develops it in his own personal and literary way. He suggests that the way to achieve equanimity about death is through familiarity, through spending enough time with the thought of it, that it loses the quality of strangeness and alarm that makes it so overwhelming when one has avoided thinking about it. He notes that death is everywhere in life, that each day is itself a small ending, that we are constantly dying in small ways, shedding the selves we have been and becoming something slightly new. The great final ending is, in this sense, continuous with all the smaller endings that life already consists of. It is not alien to experience, but woven through it. The question of personal identity is one that intersects with the philosophy of death in particularly interesting ways. When we think about death, we typically think about it as the death of a person, a specific, particular person with a specific history, specific relationships, specific projects and hopes and memories. But philosophy has long questioned whether the concept of a person, a stable, continuous self persisting through time, is as straightforward as it seems. And the conclusions that some philosophers have drawn about personal identity are surprisingly ones that many of them have found deeply consoling rather than disturbing. The philosopher Derek Parfit was one of the most original and important philosophers of the late 20th century, and his work on personal identity, published in his masterwork Reasons and Persons in 1984, has been enormously influential. Parfit argued that our ordinary concept of personal identity, the concept according to which there is a deep fact about whether a future person is or is not me, is, in a crucial sense, empty. There are facts about psychological continuity, about the continuity of memories, desires, beliefs, intentions, and character traits between a person at one time and a person at a later time. And there are facts about physical continuity, about the continuation of the same biological organism through time, but there is no further deep metaphysical fact about personal identity over and above these continuity facts. This conclusion, Parfit acknowledged, sounds rather alarming at first, as though one is being told that one does not really persist through time, that there is no self. But Parfit argued that the reaction of alarm is based on a mistake. The question is not whether there is any continuity between the person I am now and the person who will be alive tomorrow or in 20 years. Of course, there is continuity, psychological continuity, physical continuity, causal connection. The question is whether, over and above all this continuity, there is a further deep fact about identity, and Parfit argued there is not because the continuity is unreal, but because the further fact would be something over and above the continuity, and there is no evidence for and no need for such a further fact. What follows from this? Parfit found that, once he had genuinely absorbed this view, his relationship with his own mortality changed in an unexpected way. He wrote, in the celebrated passage, that when he came to believe that personal identity was not what mattered, that what mattered was psychological continuity and connectedness, not some deep further fact about who I am, he found that he was less concerned about his own death. Not because he did not value his continued existence, but because the concept of his continued existence turned out to be less absolute, less all or nothing than he had previously thought. Consider what Parfit means. If what matters in my continued existence is psychological continuity, the connection between my current memories, desires, and character and those of some future person, then my relationship to that future person is a matter of degree. There is more continuity between me now and me tomorrow than between me now and me in 30 years. There is more continuity between me now and my child than between me now and a complete stranger. The sharp boundary between self and other, between the person I am and everyone who is not me, begins to soften. And when the boundary softens, the sharp terror of its eventual dissolution softens with it. Parfit put this by saying that once he came to believe this view, he found that his life felt less like a glass tunnel, something narrow and enclosed, separating him sharply from everyone else, and more like an open space in which the connections between himself and others, and between his present self and his future self, were gradual and continuous, rather than sharp and absolute. This experience is difficult to describe precisely, but it has resonated with many readers of Parfit's work, including philosophers and non-philosophers alike. The Buddhist doctrine of anatta, non-self, is one that resonates deeply with Parfit's conclusions, though it arrives at them through a very different route. Parfit himself noted the similarity and found it striking. The Buddhist teaching that there is no permanent independent self is not a nihilistic denial of experience, but a careful observation about its nature. When one looks for the self in experience, when one tries to locate the thing that supposedly persists through all the changing flow of thought and sensation, what one finds is the flow itself, not anything that stands apart from it and owns it. The self is, on this view, a useful conventional designation, a way of organizing and referring to a particular stream of experience, but not a metaphysical substance that exists independently of and over and above that stream. This teaching, if genuinely internalized, has implications for the fear of death that are similar to what Parfit found. If there is no fixed, permanent self, then the prospect of the ending of this stream of experience loses some of its character as the annihilation of something absolute. It remains a loss. The flow of this particular experience will cease, but the loss is not the destruction of a metaphysical substance. It is the ending of a pattern, a process, a way of flowing. And this, while still significant, is a different thing from what the naive picture of a fixed self being destroyed would suggest. There is also a philosophical tradition that finds in the relationship between the generations, between the living and those who came before and those who will come after, a kind of consolation for personal mortality. The philosopher Samuel Scheffler, in a short and beautiful book called Death and the Afterlife, explores what he calls the afterlife, in which we actually believe not any supernatural persistence of consciousness, but the continuing existence of the world and of the human project after our deaths. Scheffler asks his readers to consider how their attitude toward death would change if they knew that immediately after their deaths, the entire human project, all the future generations, all the continued unfolding of history and culture and love would simply cease. Most people find, on reflection, that this prospect would be far more disturbing than the prospect of their own death under ordinary circumstances, which suggests, Scheffler argues, that much of what makes our own lives feel worthwhile depends on our implicit assumption that the human project continues beyond us, that the things we care about and the values we live by will continue to have a context, a world in which they matter. This is a profound observation. Much of what makes a life meaningful depends on its being embedded in something larger than itself, in a community, a tradition, a continuing story. The individual life is, in this sense, not complete in itself, but part of a larger fabric. To know that one is a strand in that fabric, that one is connected to what came before and to what will come after, is itself a form of consolation, not because it makes death less final, but because it gives the life that precedes it a kind of significance that extends beyond its own duration. The philosopher and psychologist William James, writing at the turn of the 20th century, reflected on death in a way that is more personal and more varied than his philosophical contemporaries. James was deeply interested in religious experience, and he brought to his reflections on death a pluralism about the forms that consolation and equanimity might take, a recognition that different people find peace with their mortality in different ways, and that no single philosophical account is likely to be adequate for everyone. For some people, the Epicurean argument is genuinely helpful. For others, the Stoic practice of memento mori provides a framework. For still others, it is a religious understanding, a belief in the continuation of consciousness after death, or a sense of being held by a reality larger than oneself that enables equanimity. James was not willing to dismiss religious consolations as mere self-deception. His careful and sympathetic account of religious experience in the varieties of religious experience takes seriously the possibility that the experiences that many people describe as encounters with a transcendent reality, experiences of being held, guided, or loved by something beyond the ordinary self, may be genuine encounters with something real, even if our concepts for describing that something are inevitably inadequate. James was a pragmatist, and for the pragmatist, the question of whether a belief is true is inseparable from the question of what difference it makes in practice. A belief that enables a person to face death with genuine serenity, to live with greater compassion and generosity, to find meaning where otherwise there would be despair. Such a belief, James thought, deserves serious philosophical consideration, not dismissal. This is not an argument for wishful thinking or for believing things without evidence. It is an argument for a certain kind of philosophical humility about the range of ways in which the challenge of mortality can be met, and about the range of resources, philosophical, religious, aesthetic, relational, that human beings have developed for meeting it. The philosophy of death is not only about one's own death, it is equally, and in some ways more immediately, about the deaths of others, about grief, about loss, about the experience of a world from which someone has been subtracted who seemed to be one of its permanent features. The death of another person we love is, for many people, their most immediate and most vivid encounter with mortality, more present and more transformative than any merely abstract contemplation of their own eventual ending. Grief is one of the most profound and complex of human experiences, and philosophers have engaged with it in ways that are not always well known, but are often deeply illuminating. The philosopher Roland Barthes kept a journal of his grief following the death of his mother, which was published posthumously as Mourning Diary. Barthes does not philosophize in the diary in the way of academic philosophy. There are no arguments, no theories, no systematic frameworks. What there is instead is a kind of minute and honest phenomenological record of what grief actually feels like from the inside. The way it comes and goes, the way it ambushes one at unexpected moments, the way the world seems both changed and unchanged by the presence of the absence. What Barthes captures, among many other things, is the strangeness of grief as a form of relationship with someone who is no longer present. The grief does not feel like an absence of the person so much as a continued presence of them, a presence defined by loss, but a presence nonetheless. The person who is gone continues to be thought about, spoken to in imagination, encountered in dreams, felt in the gap they have left. The philosopher who has lost a beloved other knows that the conventional philosophical categories of presence and absence do not capture the reality of mourning, that the dead continue to have a kind of life in the minds and hearts of those who loved them, and that this continued life is not merely a psychological consolation, but a real form of relationship, different from but not simply inferior to the relationship of two living people. The philosopher C.S. Lewis, who is better known as a novelist and theologian, wrote a journal of his grief after the death of his wife Joy, published as A Grief Observed. What is striking about Lewis's account is its honesty about the way grief can destabilize not only one's emotions, but one's philosophical and theological frameworks. The way that the actual experience of loss can make the consolations one believed in intellectually feel suddenly inadequate, thin, insufficient. Lewis found that his theological convictions, which he had articulated with great clarity and confidence in his earlier work, did not simply absorb the blow of his wife's death. The door to what he had relied on seemed for a time to be slammed shut, and working through this experience, finding his way back to a more adequate, more tested, more genuinely earned conviction, required a kind of honesty that is philosophically exemplary, whatever one thinks of his specific conclusions. What Lewis's account illustrates, among other things, is that the philosophy of death cannot be done entirely in the abstract. It is one thing to accept the Epicurean argument intellectually when death is distant. It is another thing to stand in the presence of the death of someone one loves and to find that the argument, while logically valid, does not speak to what one is actually experiencing. The philosophy of death that is worth having is one that has been tested against actual experience, against the texture of real grief, real loss, real confrontation with the ending of a beloved life. The existentialist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir wrote a remarkable book about the death of her mother, called A Very Easy Death. De Beauvoir was a philosopher of freedom and radical choice. She had spent her intellectual life arguing that human beings are defined by their choices, their projects, their refusal to be reduced to any fixed essence. And yet, the death of her mother, even though it came after a long life, even though she had not had an easy relationship with her mother, even though she had thought she was prepared, struck her with a force that she had not anticipated. She describes the experience with precision and honesty. She had thought she had made her peace with death. She found instead that the actual event was something different from her philosophical preparation for it. What de Beauvoir's account suggests is that the relationship between philosophical understanding and lived experience is not straightforwardly one of preparation and completion, of doing the philosophy first and then being ready for the experience. The experience itself teaches something that the philosophy could only point toward. This does not mean the philosophy is useless. It means that philosophical understanding of death is something that grows and deepens through life, that the understanding of mortality available to a person at 20 is not the same as the understanding available at 50 or 70, and that the philosophy of death is best understood not as a set of conclusions to be accepted, but as an ongoing practice of reflection that grows more honest and more adequate as life itself provides material for it. The philosopher and psychologist Irvin Yalom, who has written about death both philosophically and from the perspective of his long clinical practice as a psychiatrist, makes a distinction between a cold confrontation with mortality and a warm one. A cold confrontation is one in which the fact of death is acknowledged intellectually, but does not touch one's emotional core. One knows in the abstract that one is mortal, but this knowledge remains theoretical, unconnected to any felt sense of urgency or significance. A warm confrontation is one in which the reality of death is felt. When a serious illness, the death of a loved one, or some other occasion for existential reckoning brings mortality into vivid, immediate awareness. Yalom's clinical observation, supported by much of the philosophical tradition, is that warm confrontations with mortality tend to produce significant positive changes in the way people relate to their lives, in their priorities, their relationships, their sense of what matters. People who have passed through a genuine confrontation with death typically report a decreased concern with trivial matters, an increased appreciation of the simple pleasures and the deep relationships that make a life worth living, a greater willingness to live according to their own values rather than the expectations of others. The confrontation with death, however frightening in the moment, tends to produce a kind of existential clarification, a sorting out of what truly matters from what merely seems to matter under the pressures of ordinary social life. This is, in a different register, the Heideggerian insight about being toward death. It is also the Stoic insight about memento mori. It is the Buddhist insight about the value of mindfulness of impermanence. And it is the insight that many people arrive at independently through their own encounters with mortality, without any philosophical framework at all. The insight that the awareness of ending gives life an intensity and a preciousness that it would not have if it simply continued indefinitely. Albert Camus, the French philosopher and novelist who is often associated with existentialism, though he rejected the label, engaged with death and mortality in a way that is distinctive and worth dwelling on. Camus was deeply preoccupied with what he called the absurd, the fundamental tension between the human desire for clarity, meaning, and permanence, and the universe's complete indifference to these desires. Death is, for Camus, the ultimate expression of this absurdity, the final, inarguable evidence that the universe does not organize itself according to human wishes, and that there is no external guarantee of meaning or significance. But Camus drew from this observation not despair, but what he called revolt, a passionate, defiant affirmation of life in the face of its absurdity and its ending, the proper response to the recognition that life has no external meaning is not to seek that meaning elsewhere, not to console oneself with transcendent fictions, but to embrace life as it is, finite, uncertain, sometimes painful, often beautiful, and to find in that embrace a form of freedom. Camus's famous statement that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, the figure condemned to roll a boulder endlessly up a hill for it to roll back down forever, is an expression of this defiant affirmation. Even in the most apparently meaningless situation, the human capacity for conscious engagement, for attention, for appreciation, for the assertion of one's own values and responses, constitutes a form of meaning that cannot be taken away. The Camusian response to death is not a consolation in the traditional sense. It does not offer any metaphysical comfort, any promise of continuation, any guarantee that the ending is somehow not an ending. What it offers instead is a quality of engagement with life as it is, a refusal to let the absence of cosmic meaning diminish the immediate, felt, human significance of being alive, of experiencing beauty, of loving and being loved, of doing things that matter because they matter to us, even in the absence of any external validation. There is a quiet companionship in all these voices. Epicurus, the Stoics, Heidegger, Plato, the Buddhist teachers, Parfit, de Beauvoir, Camus, even when they disagree, even when their metaphysical frameworks are entirely incompatible. What they share is the conviction that death is a subject worthy of serious, careful, patient thought, that reflecting on mortality, honestly and without evasion, is one of the most valuable things that a thoughtful person can do, not because it resolves the question, but because it changes one's relationship with it, and because changing one's relationship with it changes, in turn, one's relationship with everything that precedes it. One of the threads that runs most consistently through the philosophical reflection on death across many traditions is the question of the good death, the ars moriendi, the art of dying well. This is not simply a question about the manner of dying, about whether death comes painlessly or surrounded by loved ones, though these things matter. It is a deeper question about the relationship between the kind of life one has lived and the kind of death that life makes possible. About whether it is possible to arrive at one's death with a certain completeness, a certain sense of having genuinely inhabited one's life, that makes the ending something other than a catastrophe. The ancient Greeks spoke of eudaimonia, flourishing, well-being, the kind of life that goes well in the deepest sense. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, distinguished between a life that is merely pleasant and a life that is truly good, a life organized around the exercise of the distinctively human capacities for reason, virtue, friendship, and contemplation. A good life, for Aristotle, was not one that was free from difficulty or suffering, but one in which one's best capacities were genuinely expressed. One's relationships were genuine and warm. One's engagement with the world was thoughtful and attentive. And a death at the end of such a life has a different character from a death at the end of a life that was never fully inhabited. The former has a kind of completion that the latter lacks. This does not mean that only good people die well, or that the quality of one's dying is straightforwardly determined by the moral quality of one's living. Life is too complicated, and the circumstances of dying too various and uncontrollable for any such simple equation. But there is something in the philosophical tradition's emphasis on the good life as a preparation for good dying that captures a genuine insight. The insight that the quality of one's relationship with death is connected in ways that are deep, though not mechanical, to the quality of one's engagement with life. The philosopher Epicurus himself died apparently with the equanimity that his philosophy recommended. His letter, written on the day of his death, to a friend, expresses contentment and peace, despite the physical suffering of illness. He writes of the joy that philosophical conversation and friendship have brought him, and he does not complain about the approaching end. This is not presented as heroism, but as the natural expression of a life organized around what he had found genuinely valuable, and the implication is that such a death is available to anyone who has lived such a life. Marcus Aurelius, in his private journal, returns repeatedly to the theme of readiness for death, not as an exercise in morbidity, but as a form of what he calls making a good ending. He seems to mean, by this, not a dramatic or heroic dying, but simply the capacity to let go without desperation, to have done what one could, to have cared about the right things, to have nothing left so urgent and unfinished that death would feel like an interruption of something essential. This quality of completion is not the same as having finished everything one might have wanted to do. It is more a matter of having genuinely engaged, having lived, as fully as one was able, the life available to one. The question of legacy is one that many people find helpful in thinking about death, not in the sense of wanting to be famous or to leave a great monument, but in the simpler sense of the continuation of something one has contributed to. Parents who have raised children with love and care leave behind not just people, but values, ways of being, patterns of relationship. Teachers who have genuinely helped their students leave behind not just memories, but capacities, perspectives, approaches to thought and life that their students carry forward. Artists and writers and thinkers who have made something of beauty or insight leave behind work that continues to give pleasure and stimulation long after they are gone. Scientists who have extended human understanding leave behind knowledge that will serve future generations who never knew their names. The philosopher Samuel Scheffler's insight about the afterlife, in which we actually believe the continued human project, is relevant here. We care about leaving something behind, not because we will be there to see it, but because we care about the things themselves, about the people we love, about the traditions we belong to, about the values and projects and ways of life that have mattered to us. The fact that we will not be there to see what we leave behind does not make what we leave behind less real or less worth caring about. It simply reflects the fact that our caring reaches beyond our own experience, that we are genuinely invested in a future that we will not inhabit. This investment in a future one will not live to see is, in fact, one of the most distinctively human features of our existence. We plant trees whose shade we will not sit in. We build institutions that will serve people we will never meet. We write books and make music and teach children with the implicit understanding that what we are doing has a reach and a significance that extends beyond our own lifetimes. This is not a consolation in the strict sense. It does not make one's own death less of an ending, but it does locate that ending within a larger story, and it gives the life that precedes the ending a kind of significance that does not depend entirely on the continuation of the individual who lived it. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, in her major work, The Human Condition, distinguished among three fundamental modes of human activity: labor, work, and action. Labor is the activity of meeting biological needs, constantly repeated and leaving nothing permanent behind. Work is the making of durable objects, things that outlast the human activity that produced them. An action is the distinctively human activity of inserting oneself into the human world through deeds and words, through the unpredictable, creative, story-generating activity of living among others, beginning new things, participating in the ongoing human story. Arendt found in action the primary source of human meaning and the primary form of human immortality. Not the immortality of the soul, not the perpetuation of one's biological existence, but the immortality of having acted, having begun something, having left a trace in the shared human story that persists beyond one's own existence. Arendt's concept of natality, the fact that with every new birth, something radically new and unpredictable is introduced into the world, is, in a sense, the mirror image of mortality. We are born to die, but we are also born to begin, to initiate something that could not have been predicted and that changes, however slightly or significantly, the world it enters. Every human life is a new beginning, a new introduction of novelty into the human story. And this quality of beginning, of novelty, of irreducible particularity, is not diminished by the fact that the beginner will eventually cease. On the contrary, the finitude of each life is part of what makes it distinct, what makes it this life and not some other, this person and not some general human type. There is a philosopher of the 20th century whose engagement with death and time is worth dwelling on in closing: Martin Heidegger, whom we encountered earlier in connection with being toward death, but who has more to offer than the notion of angst. Heidegger believed that authentic existence, a life genuinely owned and genuinely inhabited, required the acceptance not only of one's own mortality, but of what he called thrownness. The fact that one finds oneself always already in a particular situation, in a particular time and place and culture and body, with particular possibilities open and others closed, none of which one chose. We are thrown into existence, as Heidegger puts it, before we have any opportunity to decide the terms of our arrival. This thrownness might seem to be a further cause for anxiety if we did not choose our circumstances, if the fundamental conditions of our existence are simply given rather than freely selected. Then, in what sense do we have genuine freedom? But Heidegger's point is that authentic freedom is not the freedom to choose one's starting conditions, but the freedom to own them, to take up what one has been given, to make it genuinely one's own through choice and action and commitment, rather than simply being carried along by it unreflectively. The authentic person does not resent the conditions they did not choose, but inhabits them honestly, makes the most of what is available within them, and faces the ending that is already implicit in the beginning with eyes open rather than averted. This is, at its heart, a teaching about acceptance, not passive resignation, but the active, clear-eyed acceptance that comes from understanding. To accept one's mortality is not to be defeated by it. It is to have a more honest and therefore a more free relationship with the life one is actually living. The person who has genuinely accepted their mortality is not diminished by that acceptance. They are freed by it, freed from the desperate clinging to permanence that distorts so much of ordinary life, freed to inhabit what is genuinely available rather than grasping at what is not, freed to be present to this life as it actually is, rather than spending it in anticipation of a different and better one that never quite arrives. The philosopher and writer Iris Murdoch, in one of her philosophical works, speaks of the importance of attending clearly to reality, of seeing things as they are, without the distortions of fantasy, self-deception, and wishful thinking. She connects this capacity for clear attention to the moral life, to the ability to really see other people, to act from a genuine rather than a self-serving love. And she suggests that the awareness of one's own mortality can contribute to this clarity of attention, that the knowledge of ending can strip away certain forms of self-importance, can quiet the ego's constant noise and need and allow something more genuinely receptive to emerge. What all these strands of philosophical reflection have in common is not a particular conclusion about what happens after death, not a shared metaphysics of the soul, not even a single recommended practice. What they share is a conviction that death is not a subject to be avoided, but one to be approached, with whatever combination of honesty, patience, curiosity, and gentleness one can bring to it. That the philosophers and teachers who have engaged most deeply with mortality have tended to find, in that engagement, not more fear, but less. Not because they discovered certainty where there was uncertainty, but because they found that sitting with the question of death, honestly, over time, gradually changes its texture from something alien and threatening to something more familiar, more fully part of the life it belongs to. The Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno wrote that man is the only animal who knows he will die, and he is therefore the only animal who wonders, who questions, who philosophizes. Death, in this reading, is not only the ending of life, but one of the primary conditions of the philosophical life, the fact that gives urgency and depth to all our wondering. We would not ask with such intensity what a life well lived consists of if we did not know it was finite. We would not love with such tenderness if we did not know that what we love is mortal. We would not find sunsets beautiful if the day did not end. The ending is part of what gives the whole its character, its poignancy, its preciousness, its irreplaceable particularity. The ancient wisdom traditions of Japan, too, understood this intimately. The aesthetic concept of mono, no aware, the pathos of things, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence is woven through Japanese art, poetry, and philosophy. The falling of cherry blossoms is beautiful, partly because it ends so quickly. The autumn leaves are poignant because they are already beginning their change toward brown and then toward bare branches. The awareness of impermanence does not dampen appreciation, but deepens it, gives it a quality of attention and tenderness that mere permanence would not call forth. This is, in the end, perhaps the deepest philosophical gift that reflection on death can offer. Not the elimination of the fear of dying, not a guarantee of anything beyond the ending, but a changed quality of presence to what is here, a deeper appreciation of the extraordinary, improbable, specific gift of this life, in all its finitude and particularity. Every philosophical tradition we have encountered tonight has, in its own way, arrived at something like this. The Epicurean who has stopped fearing death lives more freely. The Stoic who practices memento mori loves more generously. The Buddhist who has understood impermanence is more fully present. The Heideggerian who has confronted being toward death chooses more authentically. The Parfit influence thinker who has loosened the grip of the separate self connects more openly. The philosophy of death, approached with patience and without urgency, is not ultimately a philosophy of ending. It is a philosophy of presence, of being more fully and more honestly alive to the life one is actually living in all its fragility and its richness for whatever duration it is given. The question of death, like the question of truth and the question of existence, is one that does not close. It is one that keeps offering new dimensions, new angles of approach, new moments of recognition, as long as one is willing to spend quiet time with it. And that willingness to think carefully, to feel honestly, to sit with what is genuinely uncertain rather than retreating into false comfort or false despair, is itself one of the finest things that philosophy makes possible. The world is here, the life in it is mortal, and both of those facts are part of the same extraordinary, unrepeatable, quietly astonishing thing.